The evening had started like any other at Bellevue, one of the most exclusive restaurants in Manhattan. The chandeliers cast a warm glow over white tablecloths and crystal glasses, while soft conversation hummed through the air. For Machen, it was just another Friday night of running between the kitchen and dining area, smiling politely at guests who barely noticed her existence. May tucked a strand of black hair behind her ear and straightened her uniform for the 10th time that evening. Her feet already ached and her shift was only halfway done. Still, she couldn't complain. The tips from one night at Bellevue equaled 3 days at her old diner job, and every dollar mattered now that her younger sister Lily had started her first year at NYU. "Table 12 needs water," hissed Eduardo, the head waiter, as he brushed past her. "And 6 more reservations just called in. The kitchen's going crazy." May nodded and grabbed a pitcher of ice water. 3 years ago, she would have been preparing for her graduate recital at Juilliard instead of memorizing drink orders. Back then, her fingers danced across piano keys instead of balancing plates. But the car accident that took her parents had also stolen her music scholarship, leaving her with hospital bills, funeral costs, and a 16-year-old sister to care for. She approached table 12 with practiced grace, pouring water into expensive glasses without interrupting the conversation. The guests were arguing about stock options and market trends, their voices growing louder with each sip of $100 wine. "No. Listen," said a man whose back was to May. Even seated, his presence dominated the table. "The entire tech sector is moving toward distributed systems. Anyone not adapting is already dead. They just don't know it yet." Something about his voice made May pause. It wasn't loud, but it commanded attention like a perfect middle C struck amid random noise. The other 5 people at the table leaned forward, desperate to catch every word from their companion. "Chen, more breadsticks for table 8, Eduardo called from across the room. May turned too quickly. Her elbow bumped against the man's shoulder, sending a splash of ice water down the back of his suit jacket. The table fell silent. "I'm so sorry," May said, her heart racing as she grabbed napkins. "I didn't mean to." "It's just water," the man said, turning to face her. May found herself looking into the coldest blue eyes she'd ever seen. They belonged to Alexander Wells, the founder of Horizon Technologies. His face appeared regularly on business magazines, tech blogs, and occasionally scandal sheets. Worth around $30 billion if the restaurant gossip was accurate. "Get her fired," said one of his companions, a thin woman with diamond earrings. "This place is supposed to be 5-star. Wells raised his hand, silencing the woman without looking at her. His gaze remained fixed on May, but not on her face. He was studying her hands as she frantically dabbed his jacket with napkins. "Those aren't waitress hands," he said. May froze. "Excuse me?" "Your hands. The calluses on your fingertips, the stretched skin between your fingers." He took her wrist, turning her palm upward. "Pianist's hands, and not amateur ones." May pulled her hand away, suddenly conscious of the other servers watching. The last thing she needed was to become the night staff gossip. "I need to get back to work, sir. I'll have your jacket dried." "What's your name?" Wells asked, ignoring her attempt to leave. "May Chen." Something flickered across his face. "Chen? There was a May Chen who won the Eastern Regional Piano Competition 4 years ago. Performed Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3. Heat rose to May's cheeks. That competition had been her stepping stone to Juilliard before everything changed. That was a long time ago. Why is a concert pianist serving drinks at Bellevue? The table was watching them now, along with nearby diners who had recognized Wells. May felt her throat tighten. She didn't discuss her past with customers, especially not wealthy ones who thought everyone's story was their entertainment. "Life happens," she said simply. "Now, if you'll excuse me, do you still play?" Wells asked, his voice softer but no less demanding. "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. 3 years since she'd touched a piano. 3 years of working double shifts, helping with homework, paying bills, and falling asleep too exhausted to dream about what might have been. Wells studied her face, then glanced toward the far corner of the restaurant where a grand piano sat untouched. It was mostly for show, part of the restaurant's old-world ambiance. "That piano," he said. "Does it work?" "I wouldn't know." "Alexander," interrupted one of his companions, a balding man checking his watch. "We have the Richardson contract to discuss." Wells ignored him. "Play something for us. It wasn't a request." The table fell silent again, and May became aware that several nearby diners had overheard. She could feel Eduardo's eyes burning into her back from across the room. "I'm working. Mr. Wells, I'll speak to your manager." He gestured toward Eduardo, who immediately hurried over. "Is there a problem, sir?" Eduardo asked, shooting May a warning look. "No problem. I'd like her to play the piano for us." Wells nodded toward the instrument. "Is that possible?" Eduardo's face cycled through several expressions: confusion, concern, and finally the practiced smile he reserved for wealthy patrons. "The piano is mostly decorative, sir. I'm not sure it's even been tuned recently." That wasn't my question. May watched Eduardo's internal struggle. On one hand, asking a server to perform was irregular and potentially disruptive. On the other hand, Alexander Wells could buy the entire restaurant with what he probably spent on breakfast. "Of course, Mr. Wells, if May is comfortable with it." Eduardo looked at her, his expression clearly communicating that her comfort was irrelevant. Wells turned to her, eyebrows raised in challenge. "Well, May-chan, one song. I'm curious what makes someone abandon a gift like yours." "I didn't abandon anything," May said quietly. "I made a choice." The restaurant had grown quieter, with nearby tables turning to watch the exchange. May could feel dozens of eyes on her, the staff, the customers, and most intensely Alexander Wells with his calculating gaze. She should refuse. Walk away, maybe even quit. She had applications out at 3 other restaurants that paid nearly as well. But something in Wells's challenge struck a nerve. The assumption that she'd given up her music willingly, as if it had been a simple choice, rather than having it torn away. "Fine," she said. "One song." Eduardo's eyes widened in surprise. "May, you don't have to." "It's okay," she told him, though it wasn't. She untied her apron and handed it to him. "I'll be quick." As she walked toward the piano, the restaurant grew even quieter. Silverware stopped clinking against plates. Conversations paused mid-sentence. May felt as though she were walking through water, each step requiring more effort than the last. The piano stood on a small raised platform, barely a stage. Its black surface gleamed under the chandelier light, but May knew appearances could be deceiving. A beautiful piano could sound terrible if neglected. She sat on the bench, adjusting it by habit. Her uniform skirt felt too tight, her shoes too stiff. Everything was wrong. She hadn't played in 3 years, and now her first attempt would be on an unknown piano, before a restaurant full of strangers and one arrogant billionaire who thought people were toys to be played with. May placed her hands on the keys without pressing them. The cool ivory against her fingertips sent a jolt through her body, a sense of homecoming so powerful it made her breath catch. She closed her eyes, remembering her mother's voice. "Music isn't in the piano, May, it's in you. The piano is just how you let it out." In the silence of the restaurant, May took a deep breath. She had no idea if she could still play, if the music remained inside her after all this time. But as she opened her eyes and looked back at Wells, his smug expression, his certainty that he could command a performance like ordering an appetizer, she knew she had to try. For herself. For the girl she used to be. For the music that had once been her entire world. May pressed down on the first key. The first note May played was hesitant, almost a whisper. The piano was out of tune, just as she'd feared. The sound hung in the air, slightly flat and tinged with dust. She tried another key, then another, testing the instrument like a doctor examining a patient. "This piano hasn't been played in years," she said, not turning around. "Then make it work," Alexander Wells replied from his table, his voice carrying across the now silent restaurant. May felt a flash of anger. People like Wells thought everything had a price tag, that anything could be commanded into existence with enough money or power. But music didn't work that way. She straightened her back and tried a C major scale. Her fingers felt stiff, clumsy after years of carrying trays instead of playing sonatas. Some notes rang true while others sounded hollow or sharp. It was like trying to have a conversation in a language she'd once been fluent in but had nearly forgotten. "If you can't do it, just say so," called the woman with diamond earrings from Wells' table. "We're here for dinner, not amateur hour." Several diners chuckled nervously. May felt heat rising to her face. She had been many things in her life. A daughter, a sister, a student, a waitress, but never an object of pity or ridicule. And she wouldn't start now. She turned toward the kitchen, where Eduardo stood watching with an anxious expression. Other servers had gathered nearby, including Jin, who had covered her tables more than once when May needed to take Lily to doctor appointments. "This is ridiculous," she said under her breath, ready to stand up and return to work. Then she saw Huang, the elderly dishwasher, peering through the kitchen doors. He had once told her that music was the only thing that made his 12-hour shifts bearable. Even bad music is better than no music, he'd said with a wink. May turned back to the piano. If she was going to fail, she wouldn't do it halfway. She closed her eyes and placed her hands on the keys again, this time with purpose. What could she play on an out-of-tune piano that wouldn't sound terrible? What piece would work with the piano's flaws instead of against them? Her music theory professor at Juilliard had once challenged the class to compose pieces that deliberately used dissonance. Perfect harmony is predictable, he'd said. Sometimes the beauty is in the unexpected. May began to play. Not Chopin or Rachmaninoff or any of the classical pieces she'd once practiced for 8 hours a day. Instead, she started with a simple folk melody her grandmother had taught her as a child. The kind of song that sounded right even when played on an old, weather-beaten instrument. The melody was sweet but melancholy, reminiscent of rain falling on a tin roof. She kept it simple at first, letting her fingers remember how to move across the keys. With each note, something inside her uncoiled, a tension she'd been carrying for 3 years, ever since she'd packed away her sheet music and stopped allowing herself to dream. As the melody repeated, she began to add variations, weaving in harmonies that worked with the piano's uneven tuning. The flat notes became intentional blue notes. The dusty timbre became part of the song's texture. She was no longer fighting the piano. They were working together. Without planning to, May transitioned into a piece she'd been composing before the accident, a piece she'd never finished. It had been her attempt to capture the feeling of New York City, its rhythms, its chaos, its unexpected moments of beauty amid the noise. The piece began with orderly, structured patterns that gradually gave way to freer, more improvisational passages. Her hands moved faster, more confidently. She leaned into the music, no longer aware of the restaurant or its patrons. This wasn't a performance anymore. It was a conversation between her past and present selves. At her old upright piano in their small apartment, Lily used to sit beside her while she practiced. "It sounds like you're telling a story," her sister would say. "What happens next?" May had never figured out how to end this particular composition. It had always felt unfinished, like a sentence trailing off mid-thought. But now, as her fingers danced across the keys, she realized the ending had been waiting for her all along. The piece wasn't about New York anymore. It was about loss and survival, about how life forces you down unexpected paths. The final section came to her as naturally as breathing. It incorporated elements from the beginning but transformed them, finding resolution without erasing the journey. The dissonant notes became essential to the harmony, just as her pain had become an inextricable part of who she was now. As she played the final notes, letting them fade into silence, May became aware of her surroundings again. The restaurant was completely still. No clinking glasses, no hushed conversations, not even the usual kitchen noise. She kept her eyes on the keys, suddenly afraid to turn around. Had she embarrassed herself? It had been so long since she'd played, and never on such a poor instrument. Maybe they were all staring in secondhand embarrassment, or worse, had simply continued their meals, ignoring her completely. Finally, she turned. Every person in the restaurant was watching her. Some had tears in their eyes. Others sat frozen with forks halfway to their mouths. Eduardo stood with his hand over his heart. Jin was openly crying, and Alexander Wells, the billionaire who had demanded this performance as casually as ordering dessert, sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Then, from a corner table, someone began to applaud. It was an elderly man May hadn't noticed before, thin and distinguished-looking with silver hair. He stood as he clapped, nodding to her with what looked like professional respect. One by one, others joined in until the entire restaurant was applauding. The sound washed over May like a wave, simultaneously overwhelming and life-giving. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed this, not just playing, but connecting with others through music. She stood and gave a small, awkward bow, unsure of the proper protocol. She was a waitress, after all, not a performer, at least not anymore. Eduardo rushed over, his earlier annoyance replaced with something like awe. "I had no idea," he said quietly. "Why didn't you ever mention you could play like that?" "It never came up," May replied, attempting a smile. Wells approached the piano, his dinner companions trailing behind like satellites caught in his orbit. Up close, May could see that his cold blue eyes had thawed somewhat, showing a hint of genuine curiosity. "What was that piece?" he asked. "I don't recognize it." "Just something I wrote a long time ago," May said, suddenly uncomfortable with his attention. "It's not finished." "Sounded finished to me," Wells said. He gestured toward the piano. "And you made this work despite its obvious flaws." The silver-haired man had joined them. "Remarkable improvisation," he said with a slight accent, German perhaps or Austrian. "You adapted to the instrument's limitations masterfully." Wells glanced at the man. "Professor Richter here conducts the Philharmonic. He's not easily impressed." May's eyes widened. Joseph Richter was a legend in classical music circles. She'd attended one of his master classes at Juilliard, sitting in the back row too intimidated to ask questions. "Thank you," she said, finding her voice. "But I should get back to work." "No," Wells said. It wasn't a suggestion. "Join us." "Mr. Wells, I can't just— your manager already agreed." "And we're paying for your time." He nodded toward Eduardo, who gave a helpless shrug. The woman with diamond earrings looked annoyed. "Alexander, we have business to discuss." "And we will," Wells replied without looking at her. "But I want to hear more from Miss Chen first." May felt trapped. On one hand, she needed this job. On the other, sitting at a table with Alexander Wells and Joseph Richter seemed surreal. A collision between her past life and present circumstances that made her dizzy. "Just for a few minutes," Wells added, his tone softening slightly. "Consider it a business conversation." Professor Richter smiled encouragingly. "I would very much like to hear about your training, Miss Chen. Your technique suggests Juilliard, but there's something else there. Something less rigid." May hesitated, then nodded. "All right, a few minutes." As they walked back to the table, May caught Jin's eye. Her friend gave her a thumbs up and mouthed, "What is happening?" May shook her head slightly in response. She had no idea what was happening, or why Alexander Wells was suddenly interested in a waitress who had spilled water on his expensive suit. But as she took a seat at the table, surrounded by people who lived in a world she'd once aspired to join, she felt both terrified and strangely hopeful. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to wonder, what if? Sitting at Alexander Wells' table felt like stepping into another dimension. The other diners had returned to their meals, though May noticed many still glancing her way. The restaurant hummed with excited whispers. Jin and the other servers moved around the room with renewed energy, occasionally shooting curious looks in her direction. "So," Wells said, leaning forward slightly, "Juilliard. Full scholarship, I assume?" May nodded, uncomfortable with his direct stare. "Yes, I was in my second year when—" She stopped herself. These people didn't need to hear her sob story. "When what?" the diamond earring woman asked, her earlier annoyance now replaced with reluctant curiosity. "Family circumstances," May said simply. "I had to leave." Professor Richter sipped his wine thoughtfully. "And you haven't played since?" "No, not until tonight." "Remarkable," Richter murmured. "Most pianists who stop practicing for even a few months lose significant technique." 3 years. He shook his head in wonderment. Wells studied her with those penetrating blue eyes. "Yet you just played like that. On an instrument that should be hauled to the dump, no less." May shifted in her seat. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, at least not anymore. Back in her competition days, she'd performed before judges and audiences without a second thought. Now sitting at this table felt more intimidating than any recital. "Music doesn't really leave you," she said finally. "It just waits." The bald businessman checked his watch impatiently. "Alexander, the Richardson contract can wait," Wells finished, not taking his eyes off May. "What happened to your family?" The question was invasive, asked with the directness of someone unused to being refused. He considered telling him it was none of his business. But something in his expression, a genuine interest rather than mere curiosity, made her answer. "Car accident. 3 years ago. My parents were killed." She kept her voice steady, the way she'd learned to when discussing it with insurance companies and lawyers. "My sister was 16. I became her guardian." The table fell silent. Even the diamond earring woman looked momentarily chastened. "So you left Juilliard to care for her?" Richter said gently. "Yes. The scholarship covered tuition, not living expenses. We needed income, health insurance, stability. May shrugged as if it had been a simple decision rather than the most painful choice of her life. Music doesn't pay bills. It can, Wells said. For the right musician. May smiled thinly. Maybe, but grief and practice schedules don't mix well. She glanced at Eduardo, who was hovering nearby. I should really get back to work. Your sister, Wells said, ignoring her attempt to leave. How old is she now? 19. She's a freshman at NYU, studying computer science. Wells nodded approvingly. Good field. She's brilliant, May said, unable to keep the pride from her voice. Top of her class in high school. She got a partial scholarship, but tuition's still steep. And that's why you're here, Wells concluded, serving overpriced wine to people like us. His bluntness was oddly refreshing. Most wealthy patrons pretended not to notice the economic gulf between themselves and those who serve them. Yes, May agreed. That's why I'm here. Wells leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against the tablecloth. He seemed to be making calculations in his head. I want to make you an offer, he said finally. The diamond earring woman rolled her eyes. Here we go. Not that kind of offer, Catherine, Wells said sharply. He turned back to May. A business proposition. Strictly professional. May raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. I'm hosting a charity event at my penthouse next Friday. 500 guests, the usual crowd. CEOs, celebrities, politicians pretending they don't take money from CEOs and celebrities. He waved his hand dismissively. It's for a children's hospital. I'd like you to perform. May blinked in surprise. Perform? 2 hours. Cocktail hour and during dinner. Classical primarily, but what you played tonight would work too. He named a figure that made May's breath catch. It was more than she made in 3 months at Bellevue. Mr. Wells, I haven't seriously played in years. I'm not prepared for something like that. You just silenced an entire restaurant with no preparation, Wells countered. Imagine what you could do with a week to practice and a properly tuned Steinway. Professor Richter nodded encouragingly. He's right, Ms. Chen. What you demonstrated tonight was extraordinary. With even minimal preparation, you could captivate that audience. May's mind raced. The money would cover Lily's tuition for the semester with enough left over to repair their apartment's troublesome heating system before winter. But the thought of performing at a high-profile event after so long away from music terrified her. I don't even have proper clothes for something like that, she said, grasping for practical objections. Catherine will handle that, Wells said, nodding toward the diamond earring woman. Catherine's mouth tightened, but she gave a curt nod. I know several designers who owe me favors. We'll find something suitable. I don't need charity, May said quickly. It's not charity, Wells replied. It's business. I'm hiring you for a service and providing the necessary tools for you to perform that service effectively. He sounded like he was explaining something to a child. The dress is part of the job, like a uniform. May looked at Professor Richter, who seemed to be the most trustworthy person at the table. Is this a legitimate offer? Richter smiled kindly. Alexander's methods can be abrupt. But yes, this is standard practice for private performances. And the fee he mentioned is appropriate for someone of your talent. You won't regret it, Wells added. My events are good exposure. The right people will be there. The right people for what? He asked. For whatever you want next, Wells said simply. You're too talented to remain a waitress forever, Ms. Chen, even if you've convinced yourself otherwise. His words struck a nerve. Had she convinced herself that this was all she could be now? Had she used Lily as an excuse to avoid facing her own fears of returning to music and failing? I don't know, she said honestly. Wells pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. Think about it. Call this number by Monday if you're interested. He slid the card across the table. My assistant will handle the details. May took the card reluctantly. And if I say no? Then you've lost nothing except an opportunity. Wells shrugged. But I don't think you'll say no. Why not? Because I saw your face when you played. His voice softened slightly. You've been underwater for 3 years, Miss Chen. Tonight you came up for air. The table fell silent. Even the business associates looked surprised by Wells' unexpected insight. Professor Richter cleared his throat. If I may add something? When May nodded, he continued. Music is not merely a career, Ms. Chen, it's a calling. I've conducted orchestras for 40 years, and I recognize someone who needs music as much as music needs them. He smiled gently. Consider Mr. Wells's offer a door reopening. You don't have to walk through it all at once. May felt tears threatening and blinked rapidly to hold them back. After her parents died, she'd locked away not just her piano books but her sense of identity as a musician. It had been too painful to be half of what she once was, to play as a hobby when she'd once aimed for concert halls. So she'd chosen to be nothing instead, throwing herself into practicalities and responsibilities. I'll think about it, she said finally, standing up. But now I really do need to get back to work. Wells nodded, seemingly satisfied. Thank you for the conversation, Ms. Chen, and for the music. As May walked away from the table, she felt lighter somehow, as if she'd set down a heavy burden she'd been carrying for years. The business card seemed to burn in her pocket, not with pressure or anxiety, but with possibility. Eduardo intercepted her before she could reach the kitchen. Everything okay? He asked, eyeing Wells's table nervously. Yes, May said, surprised to find she meant it. Just a weird night. Weird good or weird bad? May considered the question. I'm not sure yet. She retied her apron and returned to her regular duties, refilling water glasses and taking dessert orders. But something had shifted inside her. The restaurant no longer felt like her only option, her permanent reality. For the first time in 3 years, she felt the future opening up rather than closing in. Later, as she counted her tips at the end of the night, Jin sidled up beside her. So, Jin whispered, are you going to tell me what happened with Mr. Billions, or do I have to die of curiosity? May laughed. He offered me a job. Playing piano at some charity event. Jin's eyes widened. Shut up, are you going to do it? I don't know, May admitted. It's been so long, Jin, what if I can't do it? After what I heard tonight? Jin shook her head firmly. That's not even a question. You were amazing. We all thought so, even Huang. Especially Huang. He said it reminded him of his village back home. Jin squeezed her arm. You know what he told me? He said some people were born to do certain things. She was born for music. May felt her throat tighten. I don't know if I'm ready. Nobody's ever ready for the big moments, Jin said with surprising wisdom. You just jump and build your wings on the way down. As May left the restaurant that night, the business card still in her pocket, she found herself wondering if she remembered how to fly. May stared at her hands as they hovered over the piano keys. 5 days had passed since her encounter with Alexander Wells, and she still couldn't believe she'd actually called the number on his card. Now she sat in a practice room at Horizon Technologies headquarters, surrounded by gleaming glass walls that offered a dizzying view of Manhattan from 40 floors up. The piano before her was unlike anything she'd ever played, a handcrafted Bosendorfer that probably cost more than her parents' house. Its ebony surface reflected the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, making it look almost alive. Is everything all right, Ms. Chen? May looked up to see Wells's assistant, a poised woman named Vivian, watching her with polite concern. Vivian had been unfailingly efficient since May had accepted the offer, arranging practice sessions, coordinating with Catherine for the dress fitting, and handling all the paperwork. Yes, sorry, just taking it all in. May gestured toward the piano. This instrument is incredible, Vivian smiled. Mr. Wells insisted on having it brought in specifically for you. He said the one we already had wouldn't be adequate. Of course he did. Everything May had learned about Alexander Wells in the past few days confirmed her initial impression. He was used to getting exactly what he wanted, exactly how he wanted it. I'll leave you to practice, Vivian said. There's water and snacks in that cabinet. The room is soundproofed, so don't worry about disturbing anyone. She paused at the door. The charity event starts at 7 tomorrow evening. A car will pick you up at 5. When Vivian had gone, May took a deep breath and began to play. She started with basic scales and arpeggios, reacquainting her fingers with movements they had once performed automatically. The piano responded to her lightest touch, producing tones so rich and clear they seemed to hang in the air. It was nothing like the out-of-tune instrument at Bellevue, or even the decent upright she'd practiced on at Juilliard. This piano made everything sound better, fuller, more resonant, more alive. As she moved from exercises to actual pieces, May found herself playing with growing confidence. For the past 5 days, she'd been practicing at home on a small keyboard she'd borrowed from a neighbor. It was barely adequate, but it had allowed her to relearn the pieces she planned to perform tomorrow night. Now on this magnificent instrument, the music flowed from her hands with unexpected ease. She lost track of time, moving from Chopin to Debussy to her own compositions. When she finally paused, the light outside had shifted, painting the city in golden hues. She checked her phone and was startled to see she'd been playing for over 3 hours. There was a text from Lily. "How's the fancy piano? Bet it sounds better than Mrs. Wu's keyboard, lol." May smiled and texted back, "It's amazing. I might kidnap it. Bring it home. We can put it where the TV is. Pretty sure that's a felony. Plus it weighs like 1,000 pounds. Details. How are you feeling about tomorrow?" May hesitated before responding. How was she feeling? Terrified, exhilarated, unprepared, eager, all at once. "Nervous," she typed finally. "But good nervous. You're going to be amazing, wish I could be there." Wells had offered to include Lily as a guest, but May had declined. She wasn't ready to have her sister see her perform again, not until she was sure she could do it without falling apart. "Next time," May texted, "I've got to practice more. Love you. Love you too. Don't stay too late." May set down her phone and returned to the piano. She began to play the piece she'd improvised at Bellevue, the unfinished composition that had caught Wells and Richter's attention. Over the past few days, she'd been refining it, finding its true shape. She'd decided to call it Interrupted, because that's what it was, a piece that had been silenced mid-creation, just as her life had been interrupted by tragedy. But now, as her fingers moved across the keys, she found herself adding new passages, taking the melody in directions she hadn't explored before. The door opened quietly, and May looked up expecting to see Vivian. Instead, Alexander Wells stood in the doorway listening. She stopped playing abruptly. "Don't stop on my account," Wells said, stepping into the room. He wore a casual sweater rather than his usual suit, making him look unexpectedly human. "I didn't realize you were here," May said, feeling oddly caught out, as if he'd walked in on a private moment. "It's my building," Wells replied with a hint of amusement, "but I apologize for interrupting." "That was the piece from the restaurant, wasn't it?" "You've developed it," May nodded. "It needed an ending. And did you find one?" "I'm still working on it." Wells leaned against the wall, studying her with those intense blue eyes. "Professor Richter called me this morning. He's looking forward to hearing you play again tomorrow. He's coming." May felt a flutter of anxiety. It was one thing to perform for wealthy strangers who wouldn't know Chopin from Beethoven. It was another to play for one of the world's most respected conductors. "Of course. He's on the hospital board." Wells paused. "He also mentioned that the Philharmonic is looking for a pianist for their winter season. Their regular soloist is taking a sabbatical." May's heart skipped a beat. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Richter thinks you should audition." The idea was so unexpected that May laughed. "I've barely touched a piano in 3 years. I'm nowhere near ready for something like that." "That's not what I heard just now." Wells gestured toward the piano. "And it's not what I heard at Bellevue. That was different. Playing at a restaurant or a charity event isn't the same as performing with the Philharmonic." "No," Wells agreed. "It's not. But it could be a step in that direction if you want it to be." May looked down at the keys, unable to meet his gaze. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Wells? Why me?" It was the question that had been nagging at her all week. Why would a billionaire tech mogul take such an interest in a waitress who'd spilled water on his suit? Wells was quiet for a moment. "My mother was a pianist," he said finally. "Not professional. She taught elementary school music. But she played every day of her life until Alzheimer's took that away from her." May looked up, surprised by this personal revelation. "I watched her forget everything, my father, my name, how to dress herself, but she still remembered how to play, almost until the end." His voice remained steady, but May could hear the undercurrent of old pain. Music was the last thing to go. "I'm sorry," May said softly. Wells shrugged. "It was a long time ago." He straightened and his expression shifted back to its usual detached efficiency. "The point is, talent shouldn't be wasted. What you have is rare, Ms. Chen. Using it to serve drinks is inefficient." May almost smiled. Of course he would see it in terms of efficiency. "Life isn't always about maximizing resources, Mr. Wells, isn't it?" He raised an eyebrow. "You made a practical choice 3 years ago. You sacrificed your passion for your sister's welfare. That was admirable, but circumstances change. Your sister is in college now. What's your excuse?" His bluntness stung, but May couldn't deny the truth in his words. She had used Lily as a reason to avoid music, to avoid the pain of reconnecting with the part of herself she'd locked away. Fear, she admitted quietly. I'm afraid I've lost too much time, that I'll never be what I could have been. Wells nodded, as if her answer confirmed something he already knew. Fear is a luxury, Miss Chen, one that people in our positions can't afford. Our positions? May repeated, confused. You're a billionaire. I'm a waitress. We're both orphans who had to grow up too fast, Wells said matter-of-factly. Both driven by the need to prove something. Both isolated by our abilities. He glanced at his watch. But this conversation is getting unnecessarily philosophical, and I have a conference call in 10 minutes. He walked to the door, then paused. The audition for the Philharmonic is in 3 weeks. Richter can arrange it if you're interested. He looked back at her, his expression unreadable. Think about it. The world has enough waitresses, Miss Chen. It has very few true musicians. After he left, May sat motionless on the piano bench, his words echoing in her mind. She had never considered that someone like Alexander Wells, with all his wealth and power, might understand anything about her life or her struggles. Yet his observations had cut straight to the heart of her dilemma. She turned back to the piano and began to play again, this time with new purpose. The ending of Interrupted finally came to her, not a triumphant resolution or a tragic conclusion, but something more complex. The melody transformed, acknowledging the pain of the past while reaching toward something new. As the final notes resonated in the silent room, May realized she was crying. Not from sadness, but from release. For the first time since her parents died, she allowed herself to imagine a future that included music, not as a distant memory, but as a living, evolving part of who she was. The next evening, as May stepped out of the sleek black car in front of Wells's penthouse building, she felt strangely calm. The emerald green dress Catherine had selected fit perfectly, making her feel elegant rather than out of place. Her hair was swept into a simple updo, and she wore her mother's pearl earrings, the only valuable thing she hadn't sold to pay bills. Vivian met her in the lobby, clipboard in hand. You look lovely, Ms. Chen. Are you ready? May took a deep breath and nodded. I think I am. As the elevator rose toward the penthouse, May closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. Whatever happened tonight, whether she triumphed or failed, whether she pursued music further or returned to Bellevue, she had already accomplished something important. She had broken the silence she'd imposed on herself 3 years ago, and that, she realized, was enough to start with.